welcome to the place. And this is going to be a show that may be a little bit different, but it's going to be better and better every time. And I'm hoping that Daryl and Jordan and Stephen can make this not just a great show, but maybe the greatest. Okay. And so please listen to everything that they're talking about because it's a wonderful topic. We're talking about BFO, and so we're talking about basic formal ontology. And so if you have not done, that is, some research in that area, maybe you need to tune in and then play it again and again and again just to get at what they're trying to say. And so what I'm going to do is take a back seat this evening and enjoy the show because I like sitting in the studio listening. And so I'm going to hand the ball, that is, over to Daryl, and he's going to hand the ball to Stephen and Jordan. And so enjoy the show. Hello, Daryl.
Hello. Well, I hope by now that everyone knows that this is now the new greatest show on earth. So, we've just got to live up to that tonight. I think we can do it. Don't you, Stephen?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's hard. Supernatural for me is the best show on earth, but this was pretty close.
Well, we'll give it our best. How about that? What do you say, Jordan?
I just saw the greatest show a couple Fridays ago, actually, but I won't go into that. It was a private performance, but
Okay. Well, Stephen, I'm just going to say introduce the subject and let's get this thing going.
Well, I was talking right before the show with Jordan to see what would maybe be the best way to proceed. I don't know anything about the topic, maybe 15 minutes in of some cursory information, but he and I had similar feelings. What kind of problem does BFO or basic formal ontology solve? And maybe in him explaining what problems it solves, we can get a good idea of how to define it, what its nature is, and that sort of thing. And with that, maybe we'll hit on some very important ideas, but only topically. And then maybe as things progress, we'll get into more detail on each of those. So Jordan, if you can real quickly, what problem does BFO solve for us? And then how does it solve it?
well, broadly speaking, BFO solves a problem of interoperability. Um, Ontologies, I would like to define as kind of controlled vocabularies in the broadest sense. Um, and when you're dealing with making models of reality, if making models of whatever field you're studying, you have to give an account of what exists in that domain. And focusing mostly on the material world, we're not going to try to map out what abstract entities are like, but we're going to try to map out the material world. And basic formal ontology is going to try to give a framework for how to do that uh, across all domains. And when that same framework is used in every domain, then there's a core that those ontologies will share in common, and that will make them interoperable, especially in a semantic way. And it's when it's done well, even computers can reason with it, not just humans. So, so I guess we could step back and look at what ontology is most generally, and ontology is the study of the categories of what exists. And this is something that has been going on since Plato and Aristotle, and it's been a conversation in philosophy for as long as philosophy itself has been going on. And a new field of applied ontology has kind of emerged, and that's where you build you might say a list of the entities that exist in your domain, and you establish a controlled vocabulary, where the meanings of the words you use are put down in a disciplined way, and it helps to well, it helps in multiple ways. Part of it being like if you want to make reference to certain entities in your domain and you want other people to search for your work, they can search for particular keywords, and they will find it in your scientific papers, for example. So it's good to have controlled vocabulary, and that way everyone's speaking within the same terms, and they know what everybody else means by those terms. And so you can say an ontology is this artifact representing the categories of entities in a domain and how those entities relate to each other, which we'll get into. And the need for ontologies is really when you're talking about really complicated subjects, or like there's a lot of detail that you have to get into. Reality itself is complicated, and we need to be able to represent it in a disciplined way if we want to really get into the weeds. And so the thing about ontologies, though, I do want to kind of differentiate it from something else which kind of goes with it, is that ontologies are dealing with general categories and not particular things. So a database, for example, is meant to refer to a specific body of things, right? It has particular people or particular products or particular places or something. But an ontology is more about the kinds of entities that you're dealing with rather than particular ones. And so you can build databases based on your ontologies, right? So the database will be structured according to how your ontology is structured. What kinds of categories you're dealing with. You're sorting your particulars according to the universals, you might say. But before I keep going, I do want to ask, Daryl, do you have any questions about that so far?
Well, it reminds me, and let's see if this is a good way to compare it. When I was in college, I took a course on internet. Well, actually, had a book. I think that was what the course was about, but International Phonetics Alphabet. And it did the same thing with pronunciations. Your alphabet were actually based on pronunciation, so that if you were a broadcaster and you sat down to read, you would read in this phonetic alphabet, and words that you had no idea how to pronounce would be technically pronounced for you. And so that categorized that particular thing, the pronunciation of words. So it sounds like what you're talking about is something that would be common, a common language in defining all these different categories. Am I right?
Right. So
let me see if I can give a really layman's understanding, because that's all I have in an analogy. So from a computer standpoint, computer programming, let's take an example of objects that are classes and things like that, instances of objects and things. You would want in your model of whatever it is that you're programming, you would want a basic unit of something, an object that's just, it's got all its basic functionality. Everything else would inherit from that. So you would say, you would create a class that's object, and then you would create, say, a person class, and that would be inheriting that object. And let's say from the person class, you create another class that inherits that one. And it would be, let's say, a European person or a Spanish person or Canada or whatever it is, different instances of those types of things. And if you asked a question anywhere along that inheritance chain, you would say, let's say, right in the middle, and you would ask, is this a person? For all of them, you could ask, is this an object? And the answer would be yes, because they all inherit that. If you went and asked, is European? Well, only if it was European would it be, yes. But anyway, that kind of chain of thing. So in less formal terms, if you said that a penny is the lowest, smallest unit of measure in the monetary system, then 5 cents would inherit the meanings of all of pennies. It would just be five pennies. And dimes could be built up of nickels, and so on and so forth, all the way through a dollar, through however, whatever. I think the goal, from what I'm understanding, is that you want to be able to have a traceable link in all of your language, so that all of these different nodes are entities that have relationships to one another that make sense, and they all have specific definitions that don't have a lot of variation. They have functionality, they have meaning, and you want to keep them very separate from other things. Is that about right?
Yeah, that goes into like how the terms are defined, because a lot of the time it will use what's called Aristotelian definition, where you're going to express the definition of something as A is a B which sees, and like the B is the more general category, and the C is what differentiates it from the broader category. And when you do that in a chain, you will accumulate properties into successively more specific definitions, and the most specific definitions will inherit the properties that the more abstract categories will have. For example, we can kind of do this with biology, right? So like humans are a subset of primates. So we have all primate properties. Primates are a subset of mammals. And so they have all the mammalian properties. Mammals are a subset of tetrapods. Tetrapods are a subset of cranioids. Cranioids are a subset of, like you can keep going, like they're a subset of animals. And animals are a subset of living things. So like when you get down to human beings, there's all these properties that you can infer about them because of the broader categories that they came from. So the ontology will be structured this way. It will be structured such that all the terms are going to be connected in a way. They're going to be connected semantically according to their meaning. And it will often result in this hierarchy. And so I do want to kind of get specific as to what this hierarchy is, because I think once you see it, once you understand what the terms are, you may start to understand how useful this will be.
Yeah,
so
take us there.
Yeah. So the successively interwoven categories here. The first one, of course, is entity. Entity. It's a thing that exists, and that's the broadest category, right? So we'll get specific by splitting into two categories beneath that, and they are differentiated according to how they exist in time. So the first one is a continuant and a current. Continuants are entities which continue to exist throughout time, and occurrents occur in time. And so the meaningful difference between the two is that like a continuant is something that when it exists, it exists in its entirety at any particular time. And it's going to be things like material objects. Like if they exist at all, they exist in their entirety. But occurrents are like processes, for example. They are the way they exist is that they exist like one phase at a time, and they have a beginning and a middle and an end or something like that. And only that one phase is going to exist at a time. So its existence kind of spans over time in that way, instead of all at once. And so you have materials and you have processes, for example. and each of those will get more specific. So I guess I'll take the continuant one first, and we'll deal with concrete things, right? So you have independent continuants and dependent continuants, and I'll get into what that means. So an independent continuant is an entity whose existence doesn't depend on anything else. And as opposed to a dependent continuant, which depends on independent continuants to exist. So if I give an example of each of these, it might help. So an independent continuant would be your head, and a dependent continuant would be a headache that's tormenting your head at any given time. And if your head ceased to exist, then the headache would be gone too. And so the dependent continuant will include kind of like the properties of the independent continuants, right? And each of these entities are relating to each other in certain ways. So you have, let's see, where should I go first with this? The dependent continuants branch off into two categories that I'll briefly touch on. So you have specifically dependent continuants and generically dependent continuants. So specifically dependent continuants, the instances of those will specifically depend on instances of independent continuants. Kind of like the color of something, the color of your shirt depends on your shirt. That would be a specifically dependent color, right? As far as where I want to take this next, because I am speaking in really broad terms right now, independent continuants come in two types, and I'll get into why this is important. You have material entities, and you have immaterial entities. And material entities are going to be, concrete objects that we can taste and touch. The sensible things, the ones that have causal power, you might say. But immaterial entities are things like spatial regions, holes, places. They're kind of things within which material entities will reside. And so immaterial entities specifically will consist of the various components of spatial regions, like points, lines, surfaces, and now keep in mind, Dr. Barry Smith, who has a whole channel devoted to this subject, will go into far more detail on this, but I want to just lay out in general what this is. So like the spatial components are important to an ontology because you need to be able to describe how material entities relate to each other, right? In time and space. And so that's why these immaterial entities are counted in the ontology, because the ontology itself is a representation, and we have to be able to communicate it. And so when we refer to the reference frames within which things are taking place, within which we track motion, the coordinates themselves aren't material entities themselves, but they don't exist in the world. They exist in our representations of the world. And as far as material entities go, they can break down into objects, fiat object parts, and object aggregates. So this is kind of where the Mariology comes into play, parts and wholes. And sometimes the borders between things are kind of unclear, and that's why when it says fiat object part, and it's talking about, this is where you're defining a boundary instead of this is where boundary actually exists. Because when you look too closely at something, then sometimes the boundaries get blurred. But the
Let me ask you a question about, is this a way of talking, or is this, do you think, something meta that goes over different conversations or different domains, like you're saying, or is it in the, I guess, the sense that ontology means it's independent of what we think? We were actually describing something real about the world, or is this the map of the territory?
Right. So the this whole hierarchy in BFO is the semantic underpinning of your domain. So of course we can define our categories under any of these terms. You know, a lot of the time we'll be dealing with objects, but sometimes we'll be dealing with processes and qualities and dispositions, functions of things. And even though when you go to define your terms, you're not necessarily going to include all of these terms in it, this will still be the semantic framework underneath. That's the point. This is a way of structuring. How do I say this? Structuring
Your roadmap from here to California. We could set off in any direction that we wanted to go, and we would get there with enough hard work. But if we had our roads mapped out, it would be easier to navigate for ourselves and be easier to communicate how to get somewhere if we're relaying that to someone else. Is that
yeah, and in fact, BFO's kind of been compared to the legend on a map. Is that it's giving you the general categories that you're going to be dealing with, but the map itself is going to show you the various instances of those, right? A legend will have, you know, like a little airplane as a symbol for an airport, and the map will have particular airports shown on it. So the map itself is going to be displaying particulars, but the legend displays the categories. And so yeah, I guess I'll get into occurrence, which is the other half of the categories here. Like I said, occurrence are entities which unfold in phases, like a process. And so pretty much anything that happens, right, you're going to keep track with processes of some kind. And the processes have to be kind of divided up into temporal regions, you know, just like material entities are divided up into spatial parts. You'll have temporal regions in this one too. And I think part of keeping track of the identity of any particular is you will try to track its history. And so that's also a term under process. So a process is a type of occurrent, and the occurrent is a type of entity, and history is a type of process. And I think that's kind of all that BFO itself consists of. It's kind of meant to be small and domain neutral, right? So because of how domain neutral it is, anyone can use it. And it's meant to be small so that it's like easier to use and apply. And so
are there examples that you have that have been put into place with success that are easy enough to explain shortly and have people understand.
Right. Yeah. So I want to give an example of kind of how this has been applied. Let's see. I think I have saved a picture on here.
I'd like to ask a question at this point
Yeah.
to see if maybe see if I'm understanding this the way I'm hearing it. um, the term ontology, it's the study of. Is this more or less a grouping of all studies, categorizing so that it links all studies of what exists with a common terminology?
Yeah. Yeah. It's meant to ideally allow for every ontology to be compatible with each other because of this underlying framework.
Okay.
And so I think it may be helpful to give an example that also relates to the history of BFO, where it came from. So the ontologies can be, there's going to be multiple ontologies built, of course, but they're all going to be based on BFO. That's the idea. So how are the various ontologies going to be divided up? So that will depend on what field you're working in. But like BFO came from, in part, the Human Genome Project. Okay. The Human Genome Project was dealing with a hefty amount of data where they're trying to map out all the various genes in the human genome. And they had the foresight to understand that they would also have to do this with other species. And so they wanted to come up with a species neutral way of categorizing genes and cells and cellular components and everything involved with that. And so what they ended up coming up with was they had a like biological component ontology and then a biological process ontology, and they would tie the two together. And then they would like further subdivide this. And so it's going to end up dealing with multiple levels of reality, you might say, where it's kind of like human beings are consisting of organs, right? You can break us down into organs, and organs can be broken down into tissues down into cells into the various components like proteins, and those can be broken down into molecules and atoms, right? And so there's parts and wholes here that we're dealing with, and so you can have your own ontology, like a specific ontology for just cell types, a specific ontology for cell components, cellular functions, organ functions, specific molecules, and then each of these will be tied together because of their common BFO framework. And this has already contributed majorly to the research that's come out of the Human Genome Project, because they were able to engage in computer reasoning with all of this data because they were using ontologies to organize all of that information. And so when you're dealing with like this part whole, multiple levels of reality, we would call that the granularity that you're dealing with. Okay. And so BFO is meant to be useful in all levels of granularity, where you're dealing with not just atoms and things that you see under a microscope, but also things that are at the level of human experience and things that are you might view through a telescope. Planets can be represented, and astrophysics can be represented with BFO. And now, linking, of course, quantum mechanics and astrophysics, that's still a remaining challenge. We haven't fixed that with BFO necessarily, but we're working on it. And um, uh, the specific, I don't know if I can give a specific example. I still have to talk in terms of broader categories because I'm not an expert in any of this. But uh, I kind of illustrated what I was trying to get at with uh, the relationship between molecules and human beings, right? Is that you have all these multiple layers that kind of um, accumulate, and their functionality on one level contributes to the higher functionality at a higher level, and each one can be expressed in terms of the other.
So maybe to give an example that I think everyone might relate to, and the functionality that you might get with it. Let's say we have a company's organizational chart, and each position is important, and it shows a certain relationship to the other positions within the company, and it looks like a tree. We could take that organizational chart, and we could say there are a lot of features that other companies share. There's probably a president, there's a board of directors, there's mid-level managers and all that kind of stuff. We could look at how one structure was put together in terms of the nodes and their relationship and compare those to another organization. And we could find those companies that were incredibly similar to us. And that might have some meaning for us if let's say I'm an employee and I do well at the company I'm at within the organizational structure that is there, but I don't do well in other places. Let's say I'm working in a Google model, and then I'm looking at a job in something that's more traditional. I probably won't like that. So I want to compare things that I know with other companies that are out there. And if there was a way to represent that company in terms of, let's just say, the organizational structure, then I could run a search without knowing anything about the company except for the positions that I'm looking for that any company should have, and then how those are related to one another, and then maybe find a match if they're related in the same way as the company's organizational structure that I'm involved in right now. And I think if you applied that thinking to the genome project, where there's so much information in the genes, you could find commonalities a lot quicker if you had a uniform way to look at things, so that we're not uh, having to be too particular. And you can also use your searching functionalities over that big range of data, spread it out over several different computers themselves in order to do it, to organize how you're going to analyze the data. But that may be finding the patterns within a genome using this way of categorizing the data might be a huge help in finding similar genes that have similar features that may imply an area. We might be able to point out a similar pattern where disease may occur somewhere else. Is that a fair way to say here's a good use of BFO, and maybe a way people can understand?
Yeah, in fact, Barry Smith has a specific video called "The Ontology of Organograms," in which he touches upon the way that companies are organized, or organizations more generally, and how the responsibilities of the people in that organization are distributed. And many businesses will explicitly chart this out, and that too can be um, uh, given the BFO framework to make things easier to reason with. And the bigger the company, the more useful it can be. And I think I want to see. Yeah, so like the Human Genome Project was a rather compelling example for me because of how I could just intuitively sense what it was getting at when it talked about dealing with multiple levels of granularity, where you have this string of carbohydrates in your DNA that would code for a certain amino acid chain, and then that amino acid chain is used to make a protein, and the protein serves some particular function, and that function on the cellular level ends up influencing tissue growth, or the growth of your digits or something. And so the things that happen on a microscopic or nanoscopic level end up manifesting right at a macroscopic level. And BFO is a way of organizing the way in which that causal chain occurs, because you're dealing with formally organizing the entities involved and the processes that they participate in. And that's what gets me excited about BFO is the way in which it's a common framework that can make things interoperable that way. And so far, like Barry Smith has a long, a good series of lectures where he goes into how there are uses for this in not just biology, but in medicine. Being able to represent diseases and treatments for diseases, and there's representation of well, maybe I'll get into that later.
The word you were looking for is stuff.
Yeah, stuff. So Barry has touched on a wide variety of specific domains. So he's already working with the U.S. military for organizing intel, for example, organizing the entities that the military has to deal with, because the military is big and complicated and has to deal with communicating about things, and you have to define your terms clearly, or you're going to get confused real fast. And more broadly, he has a proposal in the works for standardizing the way the federal government communicates through a system called Universal Core, or UCore. That was something that already existed, but he's offering BFO as a fundamental framework for it. There's also an ontology for economic exchange, so that'll be useful for economics and business, representing business transactions. And I would love to see BFO used to give a framework for how to write laws. That would be fantastic.
Is it prescriptive like that?
Prescriptive? Well,
usually when we're talking about semantic things, there's you're talking about how to describe the world. When you're the way you just mentioned that, it sounded like you were hoping that it would direct how laws are made or managed, and that would be prescriptive. What you should do is something versus I'm just describing how things are.
Yeah, that. So I guess BFO's first target is, of course, things which just exist, but also eventually they're kind of like in the process of working on the ontology of deontic entities, an ontology of deontology. And so yeah, that's also in the works, but he's touched on subjects like speech act theory, and where else does he go with that? There's also have I touched on everything yet? Business, government, and science. Like just everything that deals with big data, it can benefit from using BFO as a common framework semantically, because increasingly we're using computers to reason with our information, and our computers need to be able to do that reasoning for us, and it has to understand what the terms mean that it's dealing with. And so I think this will hopefully transform information science in general, and maybe it will enhance our ability to use computers. And I think Barry seems to think it'll contribute a great deal to work on artificial intelligence. And
I was going to ask about that, because the way I was thinking about this search strategies, there's like graphs, different all kinds of leaf graphs, and how to make sense of a large set of data. But it seems like if you integrated some kind of neural setup or whatever, then you could analyze the patterns, I think, a lot more efficiently, and make associations from there. Now, John Searle may have something to say about whether or not we can get past syntax and actually have a computer that understands what something means.
right.
That might be another story for another day.
Yeah, in fact, I think I remember seeing a lecture from John Searle on the distinction between syntax and semantics, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But I haven't quite delved into that in much detail yet, but I'm interested to see what can be done there. So
Well, if you have something that has a need or a goal, and you have, let's say, intelligence for human beings is our ability to find patterns, and that not just there's patterns wherever they are, but there are particular patterns that are interest, that do something for us, and that may be the one of the key things to help a computer go from this impossible impasse that Searle has about being able to pick out the patterns versus being able to understand what the implications of those patterns are. So the computers are definitely intelligent in that sense right now, where they can pick out patterns that are meaningful to us as human beings, but they can pick out all kinds of patterns way more quickly, more efficiently than any human being can. The only thing that's lacking right now is the ability to say that a computer recognizes the pattern that they have, because that pattern means something. But right, that's neither here nor there. But that's just what was going through my mind as you were talking about the overall mapping of the semantic.
yeah, I'm a bit unsure as to where I want to take this next, but do you guys have any questions yet?
Well, I did want to make a comment. It sounds to me like the basic purpose or function of BFO would be to save time and possibly eliminate confusion.
Right. Yeah. Now I wish I had a good ready-made example to like illustrate how things have gone wrong. But I would say I would refer you to Barry's lectures in particular. When he introduces BFO, he does get into specific examples where there have been flaws in previous ontologies, because there was kind of this anarchy of ontology building where nobody knew how to build them in any disciplined way. And so they would end up trying to use computers to reason with them. And then the computers would end up with confusion over the definitions of the terms involved. And Barry's got some amusing examples of that. But let's see, what else did I want to get into? Oh, BFO has in fact been put forward as a standard for how to build ontologies under the International Standards Organization, ISO, and um, also the Electrotechnical Institute or something like that. I forget what that's called. Um, and uh, it's either been approved or it's in the process of being approved right now. And once that's put forward as a standard, which was, I think, suggested by the military, that I think will also lend value to the application of BFO, because like it's kind of in this positive feedback loop where the more BFO is applied, the more valuable it gets, and then the more valuable it gets, the more people will want to pick it up. And so that too is kind of gotten me excited because of how many tendrils are coming out of this wonderful thing. It's touching on everything. And I do want to kind of give a shout out to the website, basicformalontology.org, with hyphens in between each of the words. That's kind of the main website where BFO documentation is kept. There is a book on building ontologies with basic formal ontology. That's the name of the textbook that Barry and a couple other people put together, published by the MIT Press. And I have it right here. Here it is. And I don't know if that's mirrored for you. I know my image is mirrored for me. What about you guys?
I've seen your picture. I haven't seen you in just live.
Oh, okay. My picture's not showing up. Okay. Well, I have the book here. I read it. There's an official textbook on BFO, and it will break down, the principles that were used at how to build ontologies in a disciplined way. And I'm excited enough about this whole enterprise that I would like to eventually go into ontology engineering, or to become an ontologist, and see how I can contribute to this. I guess the next step is, looking for a place that will offer formal education on that, and I can get some qualifications. But
sounds like the military.
Let's see. I don't know if there's anything else I want to touch on.
It may be enough for us to digest for a sitting. Might be of benefit to come back and discuss it in more specific an instance, a use case of let's say we mock up something and map out the terrain of the domain, and then how that improves our interactions with the information in it, or something along those lines. But I think we've covered a lot of ground. I want to respect your time and Daryl's too. We're just about on the just shy of an hour here. So is there some other things that you wanted to briefly hit on or summarize?
Actually, there is one thing that I'm also excited about. So I talked about these dependent continuants, right? Kind of like, for example, properties, what we might traditionally call, and how they depend on independent continuants to exist. And so specifically dependent continuants would be like the particular property that a particular entity has. But there's also this new category that was brought forward when it was realized that people needed to keep track of documentation. They needed to keep track of software. They needed to keep track of their data and the files that the data was in. And so they were like, yeah, our ontologies need to keep track of documentation. They need to keep track of information entities, right? Files and software and stuff. And so they actually expanded BFO a little bit to include what I think I mentioned earlier called generically dependent continuance. And in that category falls the ontology called IAO, or Information Artifact Ontology. And in that, you will have things like files and software, things which can be copied. And so this generic dependence is about how the information content entity, you might call it, can exist in multiple different mediums. And so with that, when you have generically dependent entities, they are concretized, as it's officially put, they're concretized in certain mediums, right? Concretized in a hard drive or concretized in a piece of paper. And then the information on that particular medium, that particular hard drive, for example, that's a specifically dependent information artifact. Because if that particular medium is destroyed, so is the particular representation or particular artifact, the content on that one. And so that's that clarifies the relationship between, say, someone's particular installation of software versus the more generic the program itself more generally, as it exists in its own particular revisions, for example. So I like the fact that BFO can also represent information entities, because there's going to be a lot of those. In fact, genes can be copied. And so in a way, I think those may be represented as generically dependent as well in certain contexts. So they're not artifacts, but they are information content entities, I think.
That's a lot to take in. So, yeah.
Yeah. There's
Well,
a lot of directions you can take this in.
Yeah. Daryl, give us maybe your final thoughts. What have you learned, and does it spark your interest?
Well, it does spark my interest, and I can only say what I think I've learned. But I know there's a lot of categories, a lot of different things that we have to deal with in life. It seems like the further we go as a species, the more we learn, the more there is to categorize, the more complex it becomes. And it sounds to me like that this is a system that's devised to link things together to keep them from getting too far out there, so that we can deal with things in the simplest fashion as we possibly can, maybe, which is not necessarily all that simple. But at least it's a way that people can stay connected with their particular research and how it connects with others' research.
Yeah, I like that. For me, from what I learned, it reminded me of my first job in computing, where I didn't have much knowledge of just a general computer. And I went into this room. They had all kinds of computers in various states of being put together. And I remember they brought me to one, and they took off the shell, and there were all these wires everywhere. I had no idea where stuff was or what it was. And I'm like, how do y'all manage this stuff? And this guy reaches his hand in this thing and grabs all these wires and then disconnects them and then pulls them all out. And he's like, now you can see, here's the CPU, here's the memory, here's the hard drive, here's the things. I'm reliving that experience as I'm listening to how people are approaching in an organized way how to remove those wires, get everything organized, and then organize those wires as they go back and link everything together so that you can still have everything connected, but where you can also still see and get to everything that's in between those relationships. So that's kind of my general take for now. And I know when I have more time, I'm going to be seriously reading into Dr. Is it Black?
Barry Smith. Yeah, he has a YouTube channel where he has all his lectures, and I highly recommend looking into his introductions to BFO, because he can do a pretty good job of explaining it.
Yeah. Well, Black was really close. Well, anyway, yeah. What's that?
About the same amount of letters, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think so. So I'll be definitely, when I have a chance, getting acquainted with that. That's something new to me entirely. So that's the kind of stuff I like to geek out on. But I'm glad that you have expertise of whatever level where you can relay what it is to us in a meaningful way and give us examples. And happy that you were willing to take the time to do all that for us too. So, and glad that you were back on the show. Are there any final thoughts that you have for tonight, Jordan?
I guess just to bring it all back, like my general interest in BFO was the fact that it's about interoperability. It's about bringing people together in a certain way, even though it's a very, in a more technical sense. I appreciate the practical utility of it. I think that is waiting to be unleashed in this, and I learned not just from this, but also in my exploration of symbolism recently, which I will also get into. It was pointed out that hierarchies are a way of bringing people together, but also like despite their differences. And so a hierarchy of competence, for example, has, it differentiates people according to their competence, but at the same time, it is assigning people roles according to what they can do. And in BFO, this is about, the representation of entities and doing it in a way where you represent the various levels of abstraction that you're dealing with, because BFO is at the top level of abstraction that's still useful to you. It spans all domains of the material sciences, at least, and as such, I think it has a way of unifying the sciences and unifying law and businesses, everything, and the more it's implemented, the more valuable it's going to become. And I'll have to practice a little bit more on how I teach this, but I think I have a bit of a teaching personality, so I did kind of come at this from speaking in general terms, because my particular experience with this is very limited. I've only studied the theory, you might say, rather than its application, and I'm interested to see where I can take this.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm sure there are other people like me that are interested in the topic, and I know that you're a member of Facebook's Philosophy of the Place. If from time to time you have time to write an article on a particular facet of BFO, then we'd love to hear it there. Anyway, again, appreciate your time and your knowledge and your ability to relay that to us. Daryl, good seeing you again, and it's been a few weeks, so glad to have you back. And for everyone else, I hope you enjoy your evening.
Well, it's good to be back. And Jordan, I did want to say to you, I enjoyed your presentation, and especially your conclusion. That meant a lot to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think